Breaking rules saves lives, but it cost him everything. When a paramedic defied protocol, he never imagined it would lead to unemployment, and a shocking revelation that would turn his world upside down. You won't believe who he saved, and how it changed both their lives forever. This isn't just any story, it's a revolution. Welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Mark Dawson's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel of the ambulance as it raced through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and the red and blue lights reflected off the wet asphalt, creating an eerie glow. "What's the ETA, partner?" Mark called out to his colleague Jake, who was navigating from the passenger seat. 2 minutes to Lakeshore Drive, Jake replied, his voice tense. "Dispatch says it's bad. Multiple vehicles involved." Mark nodded grimly, his mind already running through possible scenarios. At 32, he'd been a paramedic for nearly a decade, but nights like this still set his heart racing. The rain, the darkness, the urgency, it was a recipe for disaster. As they approached the scene, Mark's breath caught in his throat. The flashing lights of police cars and fire trucks illuminated a nightmarish tableau. 2 cars were entangled in a twisted mass of metal, while a third had veered off the road, its front end crumpled against a tree. Mark and Jake leapt into action, grabbing their equipment and rushing towards the wreckage. Police officers were already on the scene, directing traffic and securing the area. "We've got multiple injuries," a police sergeant shouted over the din of sirens and rain. "Driver of the blue sedan is critical, trapped in the vehicle." Mark's training kicked in as he approached the blue sedan. The car was on its side, the driver's side pressed against the ground. Through the shattered windshield, he could see a woman, unconscious and bleeding, her blonde hair matted with blood. "Jake, I need the jaws of life here now," Mark called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As Jake ran to get the equipment, Mark assessed the situation. The woman's pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. She was losing blood fast, and the position of the car made it nearly impossible to reach her. Time seemed to slow as Mark made a split-second decision. Protocol dictated waiting for the fire department to stabilize the vehicle before extraction, but every instinct in his body screamed that this woman didn't have that kind of time. "I'm going in," he announced, ignoring the protests of the officers around him. Mark squeezed through the broken rear window, glass crunching under his boots. The interior of the car was a chaos of deployed airbags and twisted metal. He could smell gasoline. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Mark called out, but the woman remained unresponsive. With practiced hands, he checked her vitals again, his concern growing by the second. Her carotid pulse was barely perceptible. She needed immediate medical attention. Outside, he could hear Jake and the firefighters preparing the extraction equipment. But Mark knew they were running out of time. In a move that went against every regulation in the book, Mark began to carefully maneuver the woman out of her seatbelt. He knew the risks: spinal injury, internal bleeding, but the alternative was certain death. "I need a backboard here!" he shouted, his voice strained with effort. As if in slow motion, Mark eased the woman onto the backboard that Jake had managed to pass through the window. Every movement was deliberate, every second crucial. Finally, after what felt like hours but was merely minutes, they had her out of the car and into the ambulance. Mark worked feverishly, starting IVs, monitoring vitals, doing everything in his power to keep this stranger alive. As the ambulance sped towards Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Mark found himself whispering words of encouragement to the unconscious woman. "Stay with me," he urged, his eyes fixed on the flutter of her eyelids. "You're going to make it." Little did Mark know that this night, this decision, would change the course of his life forever. As the ambulance wailed through the stormy Chicago night, he was focused on one thing only: saving the life of the woman before him, no matter the cost. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor seemed harsh and unforgiving as Mark sat on a hard plastic chair, his head in his hands. The adrenaline of the rescue had long since worn off, leaving him feeling drained and vulnerable. "Mark Dawson?" a stern voice called out. Mark looked up to see Dr. Harriet Chen, the head of emergency services, standing before him. Her face was an unreadable mask, but the tension in her shoulders spoke volumes. "Dr. Chen, I can explain," Mark began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "My office. Now." The walk to Dr. Chen's office felt like a march to the gallows. Mark's mind raced, replaying the events of the night. He knew he had broken protocol, but he had saved a life. Surely that counted for something. As the office door closed behind them, Dr. Chen turned to face Mark, her expression grave. "Do you have any idea of the liability you've exposed this hospital to?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. Mark straightened his back, meeting her gaze. "With all due respect, Dr. Chen, I made a judgment call. That woman would have died if I had waited." "And if she had died while you were moving her? Or if you had exacerbated her injuries?" Dr. Chen countered. "We have protocols for a reason, Mark." The conversation devolved into a heated discussion about rules versus instincts, liability versus morality. Mark argued passionately, but with each passing minute, he could see the resolve hardening in Dr. Chen's eyes. Finally, she sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mark, you're one of our best, but I can't overlook this. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full review by the board." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. "Suspended? But Dr. Chen..." "This is non-negotiable," she interrupted. "I'm sorry, Mark, but you left me no choice." As Mark left the office, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at the injustice of it all, fear for his future, and underneath it all, a stubborn certainty that he had done the right thing. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark alternated between restless pacing in his small apartment and fitful sleep plagued by dreams of screeching tires and shattering glass. He checked his phone obsessively, hoping for news about the woman he had saved, but patient confidentiality meant he was left in the dark. On the fourth day, the other shoe dropped. Mark received a call from Human Resources. His suspension had been upgraded to termination. Just like that, the career he had built, the life he had known, was gone. As he sat on his couch, the termination letter crumpled in his fist. Mark felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had dedicated his life to saving others, and now, because of one decision, a decision he still believed was right, it was all over. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had saved a life and lost his livelihood in the process. As the reality of his situation sank in, Mark found himself wondering about the woman from the accident. Had she survived? Was she recovering? Did she know that a stranger had risked everything to save her? Little did he know the answers to these questions would come sooner than he expected, and they would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The shrill ring of Mark's alarm clock cut through the stillness of his bedroom, prompting a groan from beneath the tangled sheets. He fumbled for the snooze button, his fingers clumsy with sleep before remembering he had nowhere to be. It had been 3 weeks since his termination from Northwestern Memorial, and each day seemed to blur into the next. Mark dragged himself out of bed, wincing at the stubble that had grown into an unkempt beard. He shuffled to the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making coffee. As the bitter aroma filled his small apartment, Mark's eyes fell on the stack of bills on the counter. The sight sent a jolt of anxiety through him, fully awakening him to the harsh reality of his situation. With a heavy sigh, he opened his laptop, steeling himself for another day of job hunting in the competitive Chicago medical field. The screen flickered to life, revealing dozens of open tabs, job boards, hospital websites, networking platforms, each one a testament to his increasingly desperate search. Mark's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he contemplated where to start. He had already applied to every hospital and private practice within a 50-mile radius. His certifications and experience should have made him an attractive candidate, but the circumstances of his dismissal from Northwestern cast a long shadow. As he scrolled through listings, a knot formed in his stomach. Paramedic positions were few and far between, and those that were available paid significantly less than what he was used to. The thought of taking a pay cut when he was already struggling to make ends meet was almost unbearable. Midway through updating his resume for the umpteenth time, a sharp knock at the door startled Mark. He opened it to find his landlord, Mr. Guzman, standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Mark, my friend," Mr. Guzman began, his voice gentle but firm. "I hate to do this, but you're 2 weeks late on rent. Is everything okay?" Mark felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. "I'm sorry, Mr. Guzman. I've had some employment issues. I promise I'll have it for you by the end of the week." Mr. Guzman nodded sympathetically. "I understand, but I can't keep extending credit. End of the week, okay?" As the door closed, Mark leaned against it, feeling the weight of his circumstances pressing down on him. He had some savings, but they were dwindling fast. If he didn't find a job soon, he'd have to consider leaving Chicago. leaving behind the only home he'd known since college. The rest of the day passed in a blur of online applications and unanswered phone calls. By evening, Mark's eyes were strained from staring at the screen, and his spirit was battered by a series of polite rejections. Seeking a respite from the suffocating atmosphere of his apartment, Mark decided to take a walk. The streets of Chicago, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed to mock him with their vibrancy. He passed by restaurants filled with laughing patrons, shops with window displays he could no longer afford to browse. As he walked, Mark found himself on a path that led to Lake Michigan. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. He sat on a bench, watching the play of light on the waves, and for the first time since his termination, allowed himself to truly feel the magnitude of what he had lost. It wasn't just the job, though that was devastating enough. It was the purpose, the sense of belonging, the knowledge that he was making a difference in people's lives. Now, he felt adrift, untethered from the life he had worked so hard to build. As darkness fell and the city lights began to twinkle along the shoreline, Mark made a decision. He couldn't keep going on like this, trapped in a cycle of rejection and self-pity. Tomorrow, he would expand his search. He'd look into EMT positions, clinic work, anything that would allow him to use his skills and start rebuilding his life. With renewed determination, Mark stood up and began the walk back to his apartment. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor hit Mark like a wave of nostalgia as he stepped off the elevator. It had been over a month since his termination, and being back at Northwestern Memorial felt both familiar and alien. He wasn't here as a paramedic this time, but as a visitor. After weeks of fruitless job hunting and mounting bills, Mark had found himself drawn back to the place where it all began, to the woman he had saved. At the nurse's station, he cleared his throat nervously. "Excuse me, I'm here to visit a patient. She was in a car accident about 5 weeks ago on Lakeshore Drive." The nurse eyed him suspiciously. "Are you family?" Mark hesitated. "No, I was the paramedic who brought her in that night." Something in his voice must have conveyed his sincerity, because the nurse's expression softened. "Room 507, she said quietly. "But she hasn't regained consciousness yet." Heart pounding, Mark made his way down the hall. He paused at the door of room 507, taking a deep breath before entering. The woman lay still on the bed, surrounded by softly beeping machines. Her blonde hair, now clean and brushed, fanned out on the pillow. Without the blood and chaos of the accident, Mark could see that she was beautiful, her features delicate even in unconsciousness. "Hello," he said softly, feeling slightly foolish. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm Mark. I was there the night of your accident." He settled into the chair beside her bed, the words coming easier now. "I've been wondering how you were doing. I hope you don't mind me visiting." As he spoke, telling her about the night of the accident and the weeks that followed, Mark felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Here, in this quiet room, he found a strange sense of purpose. He was so engrossed in his one-sided conversation that he didn't notice the man standing in the doorway until he spoke. "You're him, aren't you? The paramedic who saved my sister?" Mark turned to see a man in his early 40s, with the same blonde hair as the woman in the bed. "I'm David," the man said, extending his hand. "Jennifer's brother. We've been hoping you'd come by." As they shook hands, Mark felt a surge of emotion. For the first time since that fateful night, he felt like he had done something right. Over the next few weeks, Mark fell into a routine. Every other day, he would visit Jennifer, sometimes chatting with her family members who came and went. David, in particular, became a friendly face, always eager to hear Mark recount the night of the rescue. It was during one of these visits, as Mark was reading aloud from a dog-eared paperback he'd brought along, that it happened. A small twitch of Jennifer's finger, so slight he thought he'd imagined it. But then her eyelids fluttered, and Mark's heart leapt into his throat. "Jennifer," he called out, pressing the call button frantically. "Jennifer, can you hear me?" The room suddenly burst into activity as nurses and doctors rushed in, alerted by the changes in Jennifer's vital signs. Mark found himself pushed to the corner, watching in awe as Jennifer slowly, miraculously, opened her eyes. The next hour was a blur of medical jargon and tests as Jennifer's condition was assessed. Mark waited outside, pacing the hallway, his mind reeling. When David arrived, out of breath from running, Mark filled him in on what had happened. "She's awake," David breathed, tears in his eyes. "I can't believe it." As they waited for news, Mark felt a mix of joy and trepidation. Jennifer was awake, yes, but what would this mean for him? Would she even want to see the stranger who had been visiting her? Finally, a doctor emerged from Jennifer's room. "She's stable and coherent," he announced. "She's asking to see her family." David turned to Mark. "You should come too. You're practically family after all this time." Hesitantly, Mark followed David into the room. Jennifer was propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. Her eyes, a striking blue, focused on them as they entered. "Davy," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Then her gaze shifted to Mark, curiosity evident in her expression. "And you are?" Mark swallowed hard. "I'm Mark. I was the paramedic who brought you in the night of your accident." Jennifer's eyes widened in recognition. "You saved me," she said softly. As David filled Jennifer in on the weeks she had missed, Mark stood quietly, watching the reunion with a bittersweet feeling. He was overjoyed to see Jennifer awake, to know that his actions had truly saved her life. But he also felt a strange sense of loss, as if a chapter of his life was coming to a close. When Jennifer turned her attention back to him, her eyes were filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, reaching out to take his hand. "Thank you for saving my life." In that moment, as he felt the warmth of her hand in his, Mark knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had made the right choice that rainy night on Lakeshore Drive. The days following Jennifer's awakening were a whirlwind of medical checkups, family visits, and gradual recovery. Mark found himself visiting less frequently, feeling that his presence might be an intrusion on this family time. Yet, each time he did visit, Jennifer greeted him with a warm smile that made his heart skip a beat. It was during one of these visits, about a week after she had regained consciousness, that Jennifer dropped the bombshell. "So, Mark," she began, her voice stronger now but still carrying a hint of fatigue. "David tells me you're no longer working at the hospital. What happened?" Mark felt a flush creep up his neck. He had been dreading this conversation, unsure how to explain the consequences of his actions that night. I was fired," he admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "The night of your accident, I broke protocol to get you out of the car. The hospital considered it a liability risk." Jennifer's sharp intake of breath made him look up. Her blue eyes were wide with shock and something else. Was it anger? "They fired you for saving my life?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. Mark nodded, feeling a familiar mix of frustration and resignation wash over him. "Rules are rules, I suppose," he said, trying to keep his tone light. But Jennifer wasn't having it. "That's ridiculous," she declared, struggling to sit up straighter in her bed. "Absolutely ridiculous. Who made that decision?" "Dr. Chen, the head of emergency services," Mark replied, surprised by Jennifer's vehemence. "But it went through the board as well." Jennifer's face hardened with determination. "Well, they're going to have to answer for this," she said firmly. Mark felt a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by reality. "I appreciate your concern, Jennifer, but there's really nothing that can be done. I've been looking for other jobs, but—" "Mark," Jennifer interrupted, her voice suddenly soft. "There's something you should know." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I'm not just a patient here. I'm the CEO of Northwestern Memorial Hospital." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He stared at Jennifer, sure he must have misheard. "You're... what?" "The CEO," Jennifer repeated, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, despite the seriousness of the situation. "I've been on a sabbatical for the past few months, which is why my name wasn't immediately recognized. But I assure you, I very much have the authority to look into your termination." Mark felt as if the room was spinning. The woman he had saved, the woman he had been visiting all these weeks, was his former boss? The irony of the situation was almost too much to bear. "I had no idea," he managed to say, his mind racing with the implications of this revelation. Jennifer reached out, taking his hand in hers, Of course you didn't, she said gently. But now that I know what happened, I promise you, I'm going to make this right. As Mark left the hospital that day, his head was buzzing with conflicting emotions. Hope warred with skepticism, gratitude with embarrassment. He had spent weeks visiting Jennifer, sharing stories and building what he thought was a friendship. Now, knowing her true identity, would everything change? Yet as he replayed Jennifer's words in his mind, her determination to right the wrong done to him, Mark felt a spark of optimism he hadn't experienced in months. Perhaps, just perhaps, this twist of fate could lead to something positive. As he walked home through the bustling streets of Chicago, Mark allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to imagine a future where things might just work out after all. The following week, Mark found himself sitting in a plush leather chair in Jennifer's private hospital room, which had been temporarily converted into a makeshift office. Despite her recent awakening, Jennifer had insisted on addressing Mark's situation immediately. "I've reviewed your file," Jennifer began, her voice professional yet tinged with warmth. She was propped up in her bed, looking more like an executive than a patient in her silk pajamas, a laptop balanced on her knees. "Your record was impeccable before the incident. Exemplary service, multiple commendations. It's clear you were an asset to this hospital." Mark shifted uncomfortably, unused to such praise after weeks of rejection. "Thank you," he murmured, unsure of where this was leading. Jennifer's blue eyes softened as she regarded him. "Mark, I want you to understand something. What you did that night breaking protocol to save me, it wasn't just brave. It was the right thing to do. Rules are important, but they should never supersede human life." A lump formed in Mark's throat. After weeks of doubting himself, hearing these words from Jennifer, not just as the woman he saved, but as the CEO of the hospital, was overwhelming. "I've spoken with the board," Jennifer continued. "We agree that your termination was hasty and unjust. We'd like to offer you your job back, effective immediately." Mark's heart leapt, but Jennifer held up a hand. "There's more. In light of your quick thinking and dedication, we'd like to offer you a promotion. We're creating a new position, Emergency Response Coordinator. You'd be responsible for training other paramedics in crisis decision-making, helping to bridge the gap between protocol and real-world situations." For a moment, Mark was speechless. It was more than he could have hoped for. Not just his old job back, but a chance to make a real difference, to ensure that no other paramedic would face the same dilemma he had. I don't know what to say," he finally managed. Jennifer smiled. "Say yes, Mark. We need people like you, people who aren't afraid to do what's right, even when it's difficult." As Mark left the hospital that day, employment contract in hand, he felt as if he were walking on air. The world seemed brighter somehow, full of possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine just days ago. Mark's return to Northwestern Memorial was met with a mix of reactions. Some colleagues welcomed him back with open arms, while others regarded him with suspicion, unsure of how to treat the man who had broken the rules and come back with a promotion. His first day back was a whirlwind of orientations, paperwork, and introductions to his new responsibilities. By lunchtime, Mark's head was spinning with the changes, but he felt invigorated in a way he hadn't in months. As he made his way to the cafeteria, a familiar voice called out, "Mark! Wait up!" He turned to see Jake, his former partner, jogging to catch up. Jake's face was a mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and a hint of something that looked like guilt. "Hey man," Jake said, falling into step beside him. "It's good to see you back. I'm sorry I didn't reach out after everything went down. I should have." Mark felt a pang of the old hurt, but it was overshadowed by the joy of reconnecting with his friend. "It's okay, Jake. I understand. It was a complicated situation." As they grabbed their lunch trays, Jake peppered Mark with questions about his new role. Mark found himself growing animated as he explained his vision for the Emergency Response Coordinator position. "It's not about throwing out the rule book," he said earnestly. "It's about teaching people how to make tough calls in the moment, how to balance protocol with the reality of emergency situations." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like exactly what we need. And hey, if anyone can do it, it's you." As the days passed, Mark threw himself into his new role with enthusiasm. He developed training programs, ran simulations, and worked closely with both the paramedic teams and hospital administration to improve emergency response procedures. Through it all, he found himself working more and more closely with Jennifer. As she recovered and gradually returned to her CEO duties, they often met to discuss Mark's initiatives. He was impressed by her sharp mind and genuine commitment to improving patient care, and she seemed equally impressed by his passion and innovative ideas. One evening, as they were wrapping up a particularly productive meeting, Jennifer paused, regarding Mark with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Mark," she said softly, "I don't think I've properly thanked you yet." Mark felt a blush creeping up his neck. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job." Jennifer shook her head. "No, it was more than that. You risked everything to save me. And now, watching you work, seeing the positive changes you're making, I know I made the right decision in bringing you back." As their eyes met, Mark felt a flutter in his chest that had nothing to do with professional pride. There was a warmth in Jennifer's gaze, a connection that went beyond boss and employee. The moment was broken by a knock at the door, David, coming to drive Jennifer home. As Mark gathered his things to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, opening up possibilities he had never dared to consider. As weeks turned into months, Mark's new role at Northwestern Memorial began to take shape. His training programs were making a real difference, with paramedics reporting increased confidence in handling complex emergency situations. However, not everything was smooth sailing. One crisp autumn morning, Mark found himself facing a room full of skeptical senior staff members. He was presenting a proposal for a major overhaul of the hospital's emergency response protocols, and the resistance was palpable. "Mr. Dawson," Dr. Chen, the head of emergency services, spoke up, her tone frosty. "While your enthusiasm is admirable, these changes you're suggesting would require a complete restructuring of our current system. The cost alone would be offset by the improved patient outcomes and reduced liability risks," Mark interjected, fighting to keep his voice steady. He could feel the old frustration bubbling up, but forced it down. This was his chance to make a real difference, and he couldn't let old grudges get in the way. He took a deep breath and continued. "I understand your concerns, Dr. Chen. Change is never easy. But I've run the numbers, and I truly believe this new system will save lives." From the corner of his eye, Mark saw Jennifer nodding encouragingly. Her support gave him the confidence to press on, addressing each concern raised by the staff with patience and well-researched answers. By the end of the meeting, while not everyone was fully convinced, Mark had managed to secure a pilot program for his new protocols. It was a small victory, but an important one. As the room cleared out, Jennifer approached him, a proud smile on her face. "Well done, Mark. You handled that beautifully." Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest at her praise. "Thanks, Jennifer. I couldn't have done it without your support." She touched his arm lightly, sending a jolt of electricity through him. "You did this, Mark. Own it. You're making real changes here, and it's impressive to watch." As they walked out together, discussing the next steps for the pilot program, Mark marveled at how far he'd come. Just months ago, he'd been unemployed and losing hope. Now, he was reshaping emergency care at one of Chicago's top hospitals. But it wasn't just his professional life that was evolving. His relationship with Jennifer was changing too, growing into something that felt deeper than friendship or professional admiration. They often found themselves working late, sharing takeout dinners in her office as they brainstormed ideas. Mark found himself looking forward to these moments, cherishing the way Jennifer's eyes lit up when she got excited about a new concept, or the sound of her laughter when he cracked a particularly bad joke. Yet he was acutely aware of the complexities of their situation. Jennifer was still his boss, the CEO of the entire hospital. Any hint of impropriety could jeopardize everything they'd worked for. One evening, as they were leaving the hospital together, Jennifer turned to him with a serious expression. "Mark, I hope you know how much I value our partnership. Your work here, the changes you're making, it's incredible." Mark felt his heart race at her words, at the unspoken sentiment behind them. "I feel the same way," he said softly. "Working with you, it's been amazing." For a moment, they stood there in the parking lot, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, With a small smile and a nod, Jennifer turned and walked to her car. As Mark watched her drive away, he knew that they were standing on the precipice of something. The question was, were they ready to take the leap? The crisp Chicago winter had given way to a vibrant spring, and with it came a palpable shift in Mark and Jennifer's relationship. Their late-night strategy sessions had begun to feel less like work and more like cherished moments of connection. Stolen glances across conference room tables and lingering touches as they passed documents back and forth spoke volumes of their growing attraction. One evening, as they walked through Millennium Park after a charity event for the hospital, Jennifer suddenly stopped, turning to face Mark. "We need to talk about this," she said, her voice soft but determined. Mark's heart raced. He knew exactly what she meant. This was the undeniable chemistry between them, the feelings that had been simmering just below the surface for months. "I know," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "It's complicated." Jennifer nodded, a wry smile playing at her lips. "Complicated is an understatement. I'm your boss, Mark, the CEO of the hospital. If we pursue this, there will be talk, questions about favoritism." "I know," Mark said again, taking a step closer to her. "But Jennifer, I can't ignore how I feel anymore. Working with you, getting to know you. It's been the best thing that's ever happened to me." Jennifer's eyes softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "I feel the same way, but we need to be smart about this. We can't let our personal feelings interfere with the work we're doing at the hospital." Mark nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Agreed. We'll be professional at work, transparent about our relationship with the board. But outside of work, Jennifer finished, a smile blooming on her face. "We see where this goes." As if to seal their agreement, Mark leaned in, his lips meeting Jennifer's in a soft, tender kiss. It was a moment of pure connection, one that felt both thrilling and inevitable. From that moment on, Mark and Jennifer navigated their dual relationships with care and integrity. At work, they maintained a professional demeanor, their interactions no different than before to the casual observer. But those closest to them couldn't help but notice the new spark in their eyes, the way they seemed to gravitate towards each other in any room. Their personal time together was filled with discovery and joy. Weekends were spent exploring Chicago's hidden gems, from tucked-away bookshops to hole-in-the-wall restaurants. They shared stories of their pasts, dreams for the future, and found in each other not just a romantic partner, but a true best friend. The pivotal moment that solidified their connection came unexpectedly, during a routine emergency drill at the hospital. As Mark was running the simulation, a real emergency occurred. A patient in the cardiology ward went into sudden cardiac arrest. Without missing a beat, Mark and Jennifer sprang into action. Their teamwork was seamless, with Mark leading the resuscitation efforts while Jennifer coordinated with the rest of the staff. In those intense moments, as they worked in perfect sync to save a life, they both realized the depth of their connection, not just personally, but professionally. After the patient was stabilized, Mark and Jennifer found a quiet moment alone. No words were needed. They simply embraced, the adrenaline of the emergency giving way to a profound sense of unity and purpose. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" Jennifer murmured into Mark's shoulder. Mark pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes with a mix of love and admiration. "The best," he replied, before leaning in for a kiss that felt like a promise of all that was to come. 1 year later, Northwestern Memorial Hospital was thriving. Mark's emergency response protocols had been fully implemented, resulting in improved patient outcomes and a notable decrease in response times. The success had garnered national attention, with other hospitals looking to adopt similar models. Mark and Jennifer's relationship had grown stronger with each passing day. They had weathered the initial whispers and raised eyebrows with grace, their professionalism and dedication to the hospital silencing any doubts about the appropriateness of their relationship. As they stood together at the hospital's annual gala, Jennifer leaned in close to Mark. "You know," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time we took another leap together." Mark raised an eyebrow, his heart skipping a beat. "Oh? What did you have in mind?" Jennifer's smile widened. "How about forever?" As Mark pulled her in for a kiss, overwhelmed with joy, he marveled at how one split-second decision on a rainy night had led to this moment. His act of saving Jennifer had not only changed her life, but had transformed his own in ways he could never have imagined. Together, they had built something beautiful, a love story intertwined with a shared mission to help others. And this, Mark knew, was just the beginning of their journey. What did you think of the story? Please leave a comment with your opinion. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will surprise you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.